All right, thanking and praising God once again for seasons in which he brings an end to our days of difficulty. Let's look at the last two chapters of Nahum from a different perspective. The no end, or the concept of there being no end. Understanding that, chapter 2 seems to describe the way in which, as he is giving us a description of the plundering of Nineveh, there's going to seem to be no end to their treasures in chapter 2. And in chapter 3, there's going to seem to be no end to the wrong they were willing to do to win and essentially stack treasure. Understanding that, chapter 2, we might be able to actually keep under 5 minutes. I shouldn't have said it, but it seems to break down into 2 to 3 sections that, for me, depend on an extended description of simple themes. Verse 2 starting. The scatterer has come up against you, seeming to talk about, once again, Nineveh. However, it's going to establish that contrast in verse 2 that the scattering of Nineveh is going to produce the restoration of Israel. Verse 2 reading, for the Lord is restoring the majesty of Jacob as the majesty of Israel. For plunderers have plundered them and ruined their branches. Thus the contrast in verses 3 through 9, where he is now going to describe what seems to be the plundering of Nineveh. And that is, I think, where we'll see the protracted description of the chaos that will now come to Nineveh, a kingdom that was once established and assured. It's going to, in some ways, sum up the chaos in verse 8, where it says, Nineveh is like a pool whose waters run away. Halt, halt, they cry, but none turns back. Those waters quite possibly representing the refugees from Nineveh, the nation or the capital of a nation that once created or seemed to create many refugees. Either way, whether or not that is the actual application, our subject verse comes out of verse 9, where it says, plunder the silver, plunder the gold. There is no end of the treasure or the wealth of all precious things. Going on to verse 10 to describe the way in which their end is going to be characterized by a familiar term that God uses even with the discipline of his own people, that being the desolation that results after the chaos. Verse 10 reading, desolate, desolation and ruin, hearts melt and knees tremble, anguish is in all loins, all faces grow pale. As verses 11 and 12 are going to seem to liken them to a lion who has filled his den with enough prey for his cubs and his lioness, but to no end, because in verse 13, it's going to pick up another familiar metaphor, or really a familiar statement, describing the way in which God turns on those he once helped. Describing or saying specifically in verse 13, behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will burn your chariots in smoke, and the sword shall devour your young lions. I will cut off your prey from the earth, and the voice of your messengers shall no longer be heard. Reminding us of God's warning regarding ill-gotten gains. The same warning he gives to his people is the same warning he gives to us all, understanding that his people Israel were to be a light to the nations. And when it says judgment begins with the house of Israel, it is not setting Israel up as an exception to the rule he is going to use for the entire world. They are establishing the principles that he is going to use to judge us all. Using Nineveh to remind us of a familiar theme with God, that being the way in which he may allow us to rise without integrity, but he will not prolong our ability to thrive without integrity.